Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Father Ben. I'm a presbyter in the Independent Sacramental Movement. On this channel, I explore a wide range of theological topics that cover the lives of Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and Protestants alike. Over time, I've noticed that whenever I'm releasing videos about the Independent Sacramental Movement or the Old Catholic movement here in the United States, I tend to receive quite a few dislikes and criticism, and I understand why. Many in the mainline churches see the Independent Sacramental Movement as an inauthentic or a fringe expression of Christianity, something that's lacking a clear theological or historical foundation. There are, in truth, real problems within the Independent Sacramental Movement. There are strong personalities, rivalries, and the accusation that we are simply playing church. But I would also argue that there is real goodness, truth, and beauty found within the movement. The ISM reaches out to people, I believe, that many mainline churches will not minister to. People in Jesus Christ and communities that are excluded or overlooked. Within the movement, the Independent Sacramental Movement, there are a wide variety of theological opinions and expressions, some of which are extremely traditional and others are deeply progressive. And yet what unites us is a deep love of Jesus Christ, the gospel, and of course, the sacraments themselves. I run the website independentsacramental.org, which reflects on the diversity, the challenges, and the blessings of the movement. Tonight marks the beginning of something new, what I hope will be a continuing discussion, a series of interviews with Independent Sacramental Movement clergy. My goal is not to produce quick content, but to spend time with persons within the movement, clergy from other jurisdictions, simply to gather, to pray together, to share a meal, and to listen to one another. My hope is that these conversations can become a model for dialogue and mutual respect in a movement as diverse as ours. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Deacon Abigail Thacker, a transitional deacon with the Orthodox Catholic Church of America. Deacon Abby was ordained in the summer of 2025, and she serves in the St. Louis area. I want to thank her for her generosity and for her willingness to share her story with all of us. My hope is that this is not so much of an interview as it is a genuine conversation, one about life, ministry, theology, hope, and the very heart of the Independent Sacramental Movement itself. And so to begin our time together, I'd like to ask Deacon Abby to join us in prayer.
Of course. Dear Lord, thank you for the opportunity we have here with Father Ben and his family to come together and have a fruitful conversation, and that we pray that there will be a great sense of education and learning about different expressions of ministry within your one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much for leading us in prayer. You know, it was great because right before we started recording this, we just joined each other for a meal, and it was interesting just kind of listening to a little bit about your life and background. And would you mind sharing some of that with our viewers here?
Yeah. So, you know, growing up, my father, he was very involved in like the Southern Baptist Church, and he kind of went through different sectors of the non-denominational movement, Word of Faith, all the way up to where he is now, which is like conservative, independent Baptist. And my mom, on the other hand, she was in the Foursquare movement, and you know, she's since joined us in OCCA, and that was just a very, very strange way for my sense of faith to develop as a child. And going into, you know, when I was around 10, I went to Mass at the parish where you served, St. Dominic's, and it was an ecumenical Mass, and I was able to like experience the Roman Catholic expression, and that was very intriguing to me. Moving on towards when I was about 12, 15, became interested in Orthodoxy. Had a bit of a crisis of faith around 18, 19, and then eventually came back to the church at 21 through the Episcopal Church. And from there on, just got more and more interested in like the Anglo-Orthodoxy movement, which is a very interesting one to talk about. But also, as time went on, finding that, best option for ordination for me and for a ministry was through OCCA. It became my life.
And just in passing, I didn't actually realize that we had met in the past. That was kind of a surprise over supper, and I didn't realize that kind of our paths had crossed in the past, which is always interesting.
Yeah.
The people that you meet along the way and you don't realize until kind of later on. So that was quite refreshing and one of those Holy Spirit moments that couldn't have planned that out. But as you're talking, I think many Christians today, there's kind of two aspects that many Christians will grow up and remain within one tradition, one church throughout their lives, and they've committed. This is how they've understood the gospel, and they feel very much at home within that tradition. Then there are other Christians who kind of explore a variety of traditions, both the variety of Christian traditions, as well as people who will even look outside of Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, and so forth, kind of searching. A lot of people, I think, in the Independent Sacramental Movement kind of look at a variety of different churches, and what I would say, kind of sift through and look for the best of history and tradition. Over supper, you'd mentioned on how it was really kind of history that kind of initially kind of led you kind of looking more at the Orthodox tradition. Do you kind of want to explore a little bit about that?
So I had this deep interest in started collecting Roman coins. That was something that was very interesting for me. It was very cool. You could just at the time you could buy a handful of them for $40, and you could identify the emperors, and you could learn about their history through that. And so I became interested in what was the state religion of the late Roman Empire, and that was at the time it was the undivided church, but so much of what has survived in Orthodoxy is that tradition, those liturgies, and or at least elements of them. And so, that was what really got me into it. And then I think there's also that appeal of it being an Eastern religion. And as you see, as you said about people exploring outside of Christianity, a lot of times they end up exploring, Buddhism, Hinduism, Eastern religions, and Christianity is an Eastern religion that's just been extremely obscured by some of the innovations in the Western tradition.
And I think you're exactly right. A lot of people do not, I should move a little more on camera, sorry. A lot of people, I think, do not understand that form of Christianity. That, for instance, when you look at Christianity outside the empire, what we now know as the Eastern, I'm at a loss for words, but on how the church, the Eastern Syriac tradition of the church, on how, for instance, spread eastward versus westward, and on how Christianity came, for instance, to China so very early on, and as well as Africa so very early on, whereas in the West we typically think of the westward expansion of Christianity. So I think 70% of Christians live in the global South, and Latin America and much of Africa, that the tradition that those people are in tends to be Roman Catholic, Western Rite. But there's
so much of the church that is of an Eastern rite, or even of like Oriental rite. As you were saying, like Ethiopia, Eritrea, parts of India. Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah.
So what would you say to someone, for instance, who thinks that they understand Christianity insofar as the Western tradition? How would you introduce someone to the Eastern tradition? Would you recommend like a church father or fathers read? What kind of reading or experience would you recommend?
I feel like the best writer on that subject is Bishop Callistos Ware. He's the writer of the Orthodox Way, and that was really like insightful as to not just the liturgical traditions, but the theological traditions that are more Eastern, because he had a very interesting outlook, because he was pretty much the main promoter at the time of Orthodoxy in England, but he was not Western Rite. He was very anti-Western Rite because he saw it as divisive. And so I think he did a very good job of, for the time at least, of explaining the Eastern tradition to Western Christians.
What intrigues me is the number of people who are very much attracted to what I would call canonical orthodoxy today. People who basically are looking for what I would say a deeper understanding of tradition and mystery. And canonical orthodoxy seems to really provide a lot of riches as far as spirituality, traditions. I'm kind of interested, but a number of people who are big proponents within the movement themselves are actually converts to the movement itself. And so I remember reading a book a while back talking about Orthodox, basically the idea with orthodoxy, it's not so much an abstract system of ideas, but it's a form, a way of life. Do you think there's a challenge for people who are coming into orthodoxy who don't have, in one sense, kind of that background, that formation? Because it's Christianity, I think sometimes we focus so much on the intellectual aspects.
I think that's been a real challenge for I would say it's probably mostly more of a challenge for clergy in the Orthodox Church, at least from what I've observed, because you have these people who are basically developing their sense of the religion, the sense of the tradition from online interactions, and there's this, popular trope of like the ortho bro, right?
Oh, yes.
And that is, unfortunately, it's not exaggerated at all in a lot of cases. And I think, my advice for anyone who's entering, or exploring Eastern Christianity is, regardless of if it's in OCCA or a canonical church, is to just follow what your priest says, be reasonable, obviously, but, move along through that process and don't get arrogant about it like so many do.
I think that's hard. I mean, I reflect upon my own life as when I was a newly ordained priest, and I thought, I'm Roman Catholic. I've got the fullness of truth, and that whole idea. I think we can be proud of our traditions, and wanting to hold fast to the faith of the saints, but also recognizing people are at different places, and how we respond to the gospel today is going to look very different from how we would respond to the gospel at another place and time. It's not that we're necessarily, I hope not, diluting the faith, but it's recognizing that the faith itself has to be incarnate in a particular time and space. I recently was reading a quote, and I won't remember it word for word, but it was speaking about on how we have to be careful to tend the fire of faith and not just simply guard over its ashes. And sometimes we want to turn the faith into something that we simply put in a museum and protect, rather than want to necessarily live it out, or as Jesus talks about, we have to be missionaries and go out and spread the gospel. How do you see yourself as a missionary? I was kind of intrigued as we were talking over supper, and on how kind of your own ministry has just kind of started flourishing, kind of this in spite of kind of what you were thinking.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I think that has been shocking to me, like, you know, because you see different, you know, I have a mission in the city and I have a mission in Festus, which is, 40 miles south of St. Louis. And the way that, you know, the one in Festus has like grown and everything has been so surprising to me, in contrast to the city where we've been operating longer and we have less interest. But it's really, I think about doing your work and being open about your faith wherever you are, wherever you're, you know, if you're stopping through a town and, you know, talking to someone at a diner or a coffee shop or whatever, talk to them about it, you know? And I think that's the way it's kind of developed for me. I kind of see myself as like a kind of itinerant deacon, you know, in the sense of like a deacon being a servant. I serve people through almsgiving, through just like helping out people I see that are struggling. You know, if they're like, even if it's just like, oh, they, you know, trying to carry a bag or whatever, it's that itinerant service, you know, wherever you're at. I think that's the purest and most gospel-like form of missionary work.
Absolutely. And I kind of want to table that for a minute, but circle back to that. Because I think sometimes viewers from non-sacramental churches, they don't necessarily understand the threefold ancient structure of the church, of bishop, the kind of the high priest of, for instance, a territory, a diocese, eparchy, versus a presbyter, priest, and then a deacon. Do you want to just kind of share kind of your understanding of the early church and that threefold?
So, diakonos comes from Greek word for like a servant, and then we see very visual reminder of that is the deacon's stole, which in the Serbian tradition, they still do this, and in the early church, this was how it was done. The stole goes over your left shoulder, and it drapes all the way down both sides. And it's because it was essentially a napkin as you were bringing the Eucharist around to people. And nowadays, it's also used during the liturgy. It's used to signify, attention, to bring attention of the congregation to certain actions by the priest and that sort of thing. And so I think Bishop Elizabeth from New York in OCCA, she gave the sermon at my ordination, and she was talking about how it's the division of labor, and really like throughout, the little content that's in the epistles about that division of labor that we see. The division of labor is paramount throughout any time deacons and priests and bishops are mentioned, and it's necessary. And so I think for the ISM, sometimes we have to take on roles that might be taken on by a priest at times. Like, for example, I'm not going to be celebrating the Eucharist until I'm ordained a priest, but, maybe I'm doing things like coordinating the parish or the missions, and that's more typically something that would be assigned to a priest.
Absolutely. And, I want to kind of talk about that too with the Independent Sacramental Movement. But in one sense, the whole idea too with the deacon as being kind of the eyes, the hands of the bishop itself. And unfortunately, I think in a lot of what I would call more like mainline churches such as Roman Catholicism, there was more the restoration to the permanent diaconate after the Second Vatican Council. But unfortunately, in the West, the diaconate was seen as much more of a transitional kind of vocation on the way to priesthood. Versus in the Eastern tradition, there's always been much more of a recognition that deacons are a legitimate vocation in and of themselves.
Right.
And even in, for instance, the Eastern liturgies, so much of the choreography is the deacon. It's not so much the priest, but the deacon is literally telling the priest, bless master,
Right.
or it's time to offer the sacrifice.
Yeah.
And so the deacons are offering the prayers on behalf of the laity, but also kind of the master of ceremonies, even for the priest. So deacons had a very important liturgical function, but then were involved in so many works of charity, so many works of service for both the church and society at large.
Yeah, yeah. I think, after, like you mentioned, after the Second Vatican Council got more towards the idea of having permanent deacons. And I think that is something that's like really back to what we were talking about with the preservation of tradition in the Orthodox Church, right? That's something that, was kind of taken away by certain innovations, over the years, but then was retained in Orthodoxy. And I think that's part of why people are, who come from a Roman Catholic background can be attracted to it, And so, yeah, I think we see in Orthodoxy a lot more deacons because we're less like gatekeeping of the diaconate, whereas in the Roman Catholic Church, it's more of a, you have to be of a certain age, and all these different requirements. Whereas in Orthodoxy, it's more so like, I have a friend who is in a canonical church. He's in the Antiochian Church. He was illumined 2 years ago, and he's in diaconate classes. So, it's, that labor division is necessary, and having those people available and making it a more accessible ministry, I think, is critical.
Absolutely. And in one sense, unfortunately, I think the diaconate is just kind of seen more of a liturgical accessory rather than in the early church. Many people forget that so many of the early popes, the bishops of Rome, were deacons because of their social outreach to others, and so they were well known to the community as a result. I kind of want to go back because we've kind of mentioned a little bit about the Orthodox Catholic Church of America, but really haven't kind of explored that.
Yeah.
And I kind of want to turn to that now because within the Independent Sacramental Movement, in case viewers aren't as familiar with the movement, there are a variety of what typically are called jurisdictions. And as I had made allusion to before, many of these jurisdictions aren't necessarily in communion with one another, unfortunately, because of historical circumstances, personalities, and whatnot. There have been ruptures in communion over the years. And so I'd like to hear a little bit more about, and just so you're aware, I have a great deal of love and respect for the Orthodox Catholic Church of America because you really are one of the oldest jurisdictions in the United States, and you have a wide variety of Eastern, Oriental, and Western traditions within. So I think this is a great way to explore the Independent Sacramental Movement because just this one jurisdiction has so many liturgical and spiritual diversity found within.
Right, yeah. And so that was something that, you mentioned earlier how there's like these perceptions of the Independent Sacramental Movement that, it's not as serious or something. And that was actually a concern that I had when I was exploring the ISM, was like, and especially OCCA, was that, I started out, I was interested in going to an Episcopal seminary because I was interested in Anglo-Orthodoxy. And that was just not a possibility because of geographical and money constraints. But as I was like, I literally just Googled like independent Orthodox churches, and a couple came up. And eventually, I think it was the third one I clicked on was OCCA. And I was really attracted by the fact that it's so old, 1890s. It's, as you said, the oldest independent jurisdiction. And they also, interestingly, were the, in the Great Lakes area, the semi-official branch of the Russian Orthodox Church in that area, which is just, such a, seems so strange to me, like, but it's true.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, because even with, I hate to get into the weeds on that, because even the Russian church had essentially split several different times. And then, of course, especially with the rise of communism, and that even led to even greater splits in the United States and whatnot. And church history is never as plain or as clean as we would like. And when you start looking at particularly lineages and histories, there's a lot of cross-pollination within.
Yeah.
So what do you think, besides kind of the history, what kind of sets the Orthodox Catholic church apart? One of the things, I don't want to steal your thunder here, but just based on a lot of the material I read online, looking at building inclusive communities, particularly with individuals who are not welcome, perhaps in the fullest sense, at a number of other churches.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, that's probably one of the things that we're most well known for. I feel like, we have our communities are, they vary, like some of them are just, like Bishop John Neubauer's community in Indiana. It's, St. Mary Magdala community. That's literally what it's called, just community, and they can be more of like a healing space for people who are, hurt by the church in some way. And I have run into that a lot here, because we're in the Rome of the West, and a lot of people have religious trauma. And so I think that's something we have a really good placement in the broader church for. And we've been supportive of LGBT people since I believe it was the late 50s. We had the church in Atlanta that started up. It was Archbishop Lankenau. He was a seminarian, and he got kicked out over accusations of homosexuality, and then he ended up joining with a Greek Orthodox bishop who was kicked out of the Greek Orthodox Church in Greece because he admitted during a debate over the inclusion of lay people with homosexual tendencies. Basically, they were saying, well, we're going to kick him out. And he was saying, well, I'm a bishop and I have homosexual tendencies. Are you going to kick me out? And they did. So
I didn't know that. Oh, my goodness.
So he moved to Atlanta, and he got in touch with later Archbishop Lankenau, and they started a church in I can't remember the name of the hotel, but a hotel in Atlanta. And they had a community there, and it was sponsored by a gay bar.
And I was going to say, that was the very first, if I recall correctly, in reading history, that was the very first parish of any sort whatsoever, ministry, really open to people, now I guess what we would call LGBTQ+. So, I mean, kind of that whole history of openness and inclusion. And that still carries through the OCCA even through today. Several of our clergy are in the community. I know Bishop Elizabeth, she's openly trans, and she's been so since I believe like the late 90s, and she's written books about how, like, her journey as not only as like just more as a queer person in general, but specifically as a trans woman, how that like affects her faith and how she's grown through that, which I think is really cool. And so many of our clergy, anywhere from deacons to bishops, they are in the community, and they've found that they are able to fully practice their faith in the OCCA. Yeah. Absolutely. And I remember being in Roman Catholic Seminary at the time, unfortunately, with the sexual abuse crisis, and a number of people who during that time with church pronouncements were essentially weeded out of the seminary, that the whole idea that if you're not giving up your own sexuality in a very real sense, then you're not making any sacrifice whatsoever, and your gifts are not welcome here. And I knew a few individuals who were essentially asked to leave seminary during that time, and the heartbreak that they experienced as a result of that. And, you know, I think sometimes people, two things, look at the Independent Sacramental Movement from mainline churches and you're trying to take away our people. Versus when we were talking in the past, you were talking about the relationship that you have, for instance, with the Roman Catholic Church and reaching out with social justice ministry. Right. And rather than just having an antagonistic relationship, which I think sometimes, unfortunately, is the way it's presented, we do have real working relationships. Would you like to kind of talk about?
I know, like in St. Louis, it's a little bit of a different situation because we do have Roman Catholic parishes in St. Louis that are, you know, to the extent that they're allowed to be, they are welcoming to queer people. But you know, we work with them. We work with St. Pius. We, you know, share each other's events and such, you know, and there's like a there's this kind of gap there that is you know, by virtue of the fact that Roman Catholic Church, the canonical Orthodox churches, they don't, you know, fully welcome people, and we'll disagree with them on that. We will, you know, we'll agree to disagree, I guess. But that doesn't mean that they have exclusive claim to anybody that's interested in that tradition, especially if they're not welcoming. We're not trying to be a schism, and you know, that was one of the things that was really attractive to me about OCCA is that we never really had a schism. You know, we were kind of established as a mission jurisdiction, and never really formally broke from any of our parent churches. You know, and so you know, we're not trying to be a different church. We're just trying to bring the church to people who it's not traditionally available to. Yeah. Absolutely.
And unfortunately, there are some people out there who would look at what you're saying and say, this is and please don't think that this is me saying that. I just for record, I'm probably a little more traditional on certain aspects and beliefs and whatnot than Deacon Abby, and I might be right, I might be wrong, I don't know. Ultimately, God is going to be the judge, and I personally just want to be a servant of the word, and I don't claim any papal authority or magisterium or whatnot. But what would you say? Because from my own perspective, I want to treat every person as a child of God. I don't care if someone is gay, bi, anything like that. Everyone, in my opinion, is created in the image and likeness of God. And I want to make sure that every person is treated with dignity and every person is given that opportunity to live as a child of God according to the gospel. There are some individuals out there who would say that as a falling away, even that as a falling away of the gospel. How would you respond? I think, unfortunately, we have become so divided, particularly in the United States. You're either on this side or this side, and there really isn't a whole lot of middle ground.
Yeah, I think that boils down, for me at least, to the concept of, okay, so inclusion is sometimes seen, you know, like in those Roman Catholic parishes I was talking about, they'll say that they're inclusive. And I agree that they are for the most part. Maybe you're not able to be included fully in like the sacramental life up into like ordination, et cetera, right? Or marriage, that's another big one. But my position on that is that I think, you know, there are some things that are are pretty like cut and dry, like with, for example, sexual ethics, marriage ethics, in the gospel, we see Jesus condemning divorce, right? And I think divorce is not ideal. I follow the Orthodox perspective that there are some cases where it's better to be divorced than to, live in a situation where you're like fighting with each other all the time, absolutely. But it's not an ideal. And I think that's something that was really, disappointing to me about the Episcopal Church is that they kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's like, oh, we're welcoming to LGBT people. We're welcoming to people who, and then it goes on to like, oh, we're welcoming to people who might not necessarily believe in the Nicene Creed, for example, or who promote like a really like out of left field sexual ethic or something, and I think that's something that it's like, no, we're not here to say like, oh yeah, we just you're fine if you're like Gnostic, you're fine if you're like a just like a full on like dual faith pagan Christian or something. We're not gonna say that. It's like we have our beliefs that we're steadfast in, but we cannot countenance the exclusion of people when the gospel is so inclusive.
I love that.
Thank you.
And, Jesus was one of those who never really turned anyone away. The only people that willingly turned away of their own accord. Jesus saw that person and loved him, and but demanded that you have to leave everything and follow me, and wasn't willing to do that. I'm not so sure any of our churches do as well on that anymore. It's very tempting to sell out the gospel. For instance, we were talking earlier over supper, the whole mega church experience, and kind of more of the every week, more of a worship as entertainment,
right?
Versus you were attracted to liturgical and sacramental forms of worship. Do you kind of want to talk a little bit about kind of that attraction and that hunger for something more?
So one of the criticisms, my dad's rabidly anti-Catholic and less so anti-Orthodox, but that was one of the things he would always have as a criticism of liturgy, liturgical churches, is that it's the same thing, just repeated, right? It's repetitive. Oh, you saying the rosary, that's repetitive. It's not really heartfelt or whatever. But for me, it's the consistency. It's not giving me this like mental stimulation to make me like God or something, or make me like going to church. It's like, no, it's like, okay, this is something that's been carried on from ancient times up until now, and there's a lot of information and a lot of testimony to back up the fact that it's effective.
Well, and even churches that say they're not liturgical, I mean, they really kind of have their own liturgy.
Right,
I mean, you do 5 hymns rather than 3. Wait, what or you move when the collection is. Wait, what happened this morning?
Yeah.
So it's, I think, kind of more of also an issue of honesty.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget, years ago, I knew and I had been involved in the Pentecostal charismatic renewal in Roman Catholicism, and built up a lot of relationships with Pentecostals. And I'll never forget talking with a Pentecostal who did not know, for instance, the Our Father. Why would we memorize this prayer? Because we pray in the Spirit. And I thought, but this is the prayer that Jesus himself, God incarnate, has taught us this prayer. Why would we not want to pray it? And so much of the early Christian liturgy really flows from, predates Christianity, the Jewish services as well.
Yeah. I was listening to an excerpt from a really interesting lecture. I believe, I know the lecturer was Roman Catholic, and I really wish I knew what his name was because I'd like to watch the rest of it. But he had a very interesting insight that the apostolic churches, Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and parts of the like mainline Protestants like Anglicans, they follow a format of worship that's much closer to First and Second Temple Judaism, whereas what is seen more in like non-denominational evangelical churches is closer to like a modern synagogue. It's this, this long exposition on a section of the Bible, whereas we have the sacrifice, we have the format that is carried on from ancient times, and I think that's really undeniable. And also you touched on the Our Father thing, and I had a article I had to write for seminary about that whole passage, and I was just like, wow, I really thought that this was like that there was all this refutation of repetitive prayers when I was growing up, and it says right here, okay, this is the manner you should pray.
Absolutely. And even the whole idea of, for instance, the letter of St. Paul, well, probably not Paul, but the letter to the Hebrews, that whole idea of already looking from the very, looking backwards and looking forward, that notion of we are worshiping based upon the heavenly form. And initially, Moses was commanded to make according to the archetype, make according to the pattern that God had established. And in one sense, it's not that we're wanting to create a new worship experience every week, but we're wanting to take based upon the form that God had already revealed to us.
Yeah.
So why don't you share a little bit about your seminary formation and training? I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, so once I got in contact with Bishop Anthony and, it's like started learning more about OCCA, he gave me some reading to do before I was like diving into it, and once I got in contact with him, though, we started through, once I was approved as a seminarian, started through the People's Catholic Seminary, which is through the Association of Roman Catholic Women Priests, and Bishop Margaret is I don't think she calls herself the dean, but she's the dean of the seminary, yeah, that was a good experience. They have some really good classes, very thought-provoking stuff there, and then a lot of it was also just independent study through recommendations from Bishop Anthony, and I would send him updates and reports and such. Yeah, and but I think really the most important part of the seminary formation was like just. Most people do not have this experience with seminary, but I started a mission in seminary like very early on into my seminary formation. That's when we started St. Bridget's. One of my friends who was also a seminarian but withdrew, Layla, she was instrumental in that, and that was kind of like, she grew up Maronite, so that gave me an experience of like more like Oriental liturgies. And but yeah, it's I think that was like definitely the most important part of my seminary formation, was just like getting my hands dirty and getting right into that coordination experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so what would you say to someone who, and you can actually be helpful for me here, because I basically have recently been incarnated, but I don't have a community of faith yet that I've established. What would you say to someone, for instance, who has been ordained already for instance, in the Independent Sacramental Movement and is wanting to get started? How would you recommend it?
I think, you have to really look at what, kind of envision what your community looks like in your head, right? And it's like, and then throw that out, because that's not how the Holy Spirit works. That was absolutely my experience. Like, I had this idea that it was like, oh, we're going to minister to people who grew up Orthodox but don't feel welcome now, and all this stuff. And literally none of our parishioners have been from that situation.
What would you say then were the people who were attracted then to what you're doing?
Yeah, it's basically that concept I was alluding to earlier about like the Eastern religion. That's what attracts people to it, and I think that's what's attracting people to the canonical churches as well. Is that it's has mystery. It's exotic, but it's also just like. It has more authenticity to it as well, But yeah, so I would say that I would say on the other hand of that, don't manage your expectations. Don't try to be like, oh, well, it's not going to work out. It's not going to be as big as I want it or whatever. Just, you really have to go with the flow of the Spirit there. And if you can get space, like a physical space to have your services, that's really good. And I think in my experience, it's like created this sense of identity, like both locational identity and like, we have this consistent space that is up to our specs. It's not like, at the consent of another church or something, and I mean, that's not always going to be possible, but I think people are reassured by that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And, as you were kind of mentioning earlier on how you initially started out within the Episcopal Church, using their space. And then now, we could go and we could look down that, got a house church, or you're meeting in a shed. But when you look at the earliest Christian experiences, people were celebrating the liturgy within the home. The liturgy, and this wasn't just simply a Christian idea. This really kind of predates Christianity to Judaism, where really the domestic church celebrating Passover within one's own home. There was basically the home liturgy, and Paul was meeting in people's homes. What would you say to someone who thinks that's kind of a old way of...
So I was talking about it with my mom, and she was, had the experience of like, in both in Foursquare movement and also in my dad's tradition. There's this idea that it's like, oh, the church is going to be persecuted, so we need to have house churches. And over time I was, at the time I believed it, and over time I was like, oh no, that's kind of absurd. Now I kind of do believe it because, we see like how just taking a stand for like gospel issues can be like actually put you at the other end of authoritarian government's guns, And so I think it does have an advantage to like, it's fully encapsulate in the community, and you should have, I think that's something that I didn't really touch on about, like, how do you start a mission? You should have a community first. Like, you should not, it doesn't have to be a church community, but you should have contact with your neighbors as much as you can, like be in community with them. And, I would say it's probably for the best if that, local community becomes your parish, and that way, maybe it's people that they don't have time to go to the church they were raised in or whatever, and they're like, oh, well, I'll just check out this church, But I do think that there is there's a practicality to the house church now, and I think another big thing with that is that it allows us to not be so worried about, oh, well, we have to, spend, St. Stanislaus, I was at their annual meeting, they spent $400,000 on insurance a year. And you don't have that kind of problem when you already are paying your own home insurance or, that sort of thing. So it frees up resources for you to serve the people.
And that is something I had always struggled as a Roman Catholic priest, in that I felt like I was more of an administrator on certain things. We were constantly raising funds just to pay to maintain the church as best as we could. It's not a bad thing, but it comes down to allocation of resources. What kind of as an outsider now, but I was even thinking of then, what if different churches could essentially pool their resources together, buy one common building, because you're having to insure it, you're having to pay heating and cooling and maintaining it. It would be so nice if we would be better stewards, because most of the time our churches are empty, and to put it to kind of more of a shared purpose, and really I think build those communities together.
Yeah. I know someone who is looking at buying a church building. It's been empty for a while, but And basically for that purpose, like to have it available to, to our community and also to any communities that are, that don't have a physical home. And like in this area, there's, particularly in that area, there is like several Jewish families who have no place to meet for, religious purposes. And, we're just like, yeah, of course you can use the space. And so it's, I think that's a really good idea. And that's something that we're kind of working on in some areas. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Built. And I think that's what the Independent Sacramental Movement is capable of doing, building relationships between Christians. When we look, for instance, at Old Catholicism, the Old Catholics were essentially the pioneers of the ecumenical movement.
Right.
And I don't think people realize that. I mean, bringing Orthodox, canonical Orthodox, bringing Anglicans together, having conversations on these theological topics, but also building those relationships.
Yeah. It's, I wasn't so familiar with Old Catholics before, kind of like exploring OCCA, because that I didn't, make this like transition from Episcopal Church, Old Catholic Orthodoxy. It was like, I was interested in Anglo-Orthodoxy, so I didn't even have to get into all that. But then I learned about it and learning about OCCA history, and it's fascinating because I was speaking with one of our parishioners recently, and he was like, I think the Old Catholics are, other than they're the only schism from the Roman Catholic Church that is left over issues that were legitimate, other than like LGBT inclusion. like they're not like sedevacantists or anything like that. They just were like, we disagree with this like huge change in doctrine.
Oh yes, I mean the whole idea of the Old Catholics saw themselves as more the continuation of the earlier tradition of the church. And on how, unfortunately, I think there could have been a time of healing and reconciliation with Orthodox churches and whatnot. And I don't know, unfortunately, with so many of the issues of ordination of women and whatnot and all these disputed topics, it seems like Christian unity is further away than ever. I kind of want to circle back to something else, kind of on that topic of women's ordination. Some canonical Orthodox churches ordain women as deacons or deaconesses. Others do not. Even some Oriental churches, such as, for instance, the Coptic Orthodox Church, ordains women as deaconesses. They don't take on a liturgical function in the same way. But a lot of people, particularly in the West, see women deacons as a form of feminism infecting our churches, not realizing the ancient tradition of the diaconate. Would you kind of like to kind of talk about that?
I mean, I think the cultures that we see, like the deaconesses are so important, and it's, they have cultural reasons for it. Like they don't want to have, and that was also the case in the early church. I think it's just the same as it is with anything. If you only have one gender at the table in terms of, like if it's a business or a community organization or anything, you're not going to have all the perspectives that you need. And it's the same thing for the clergy. So, I would argue, I would have if someone was of the opinion that, women can be deacons but not priests, I would probably try to focus more on the deacon side of things, because I think that's pretty cut and dry. It's, but there are Roman Catholics who would say absolutely not. What do you mean? This is completely foreign. Right. Yeah. I mean, I think the fact that that Paul writes about Phoebe, and he writes diakonos and not diakonissa. I think that's very, very important, because, whatever the circumstances were that led to her taking on that role, it was not a role that was specifically because she was a woman and they needed a woman to do certain things, right? He just refers to her as a deacon, right? And So, I mean, I don't have much to, I would not be willing to argue with someone who was of the other position on that, because I think that we're just too far apart, you know? But I think there's, I don't think the fact that there were deaconesses and are deaconesses for cultural reasons and for morality reasons, I don't think that diminishes the fact that women are eligible for ordained ministry at all. You know, I don't think that those two things are completely separate.
Understood. And I would argue that when I look at a number of churches that have brought back the female diaconate or deaconesses, a lot of these are not necessarily progressive churches. As I mentioned, the Coptic Orthodox Church. Now, the ministry and understanding is very limited. Or certain of the Anglican communities have women deacons, even if certain jurisdictions don't have women priests or presbyters. We can look at a number of canonical Orthodox churches that have been bringing back the female diaconate.
Yeah.
So this isn't what I guess kind of my point isn't this liberal controversy infecting our churches in the West, but there's really a revitalization going on in the East.
Yeah, and I think that's something that there has to be like concessions for, you know, anything. Like you look at politics, you look at the church. I mean, there's politics within the church, but
oh no, Holy Spirit only.
But if you look at like all that, there's times when concessions have to be made, and I think that's the argument that's being made, is that this is like some kind of concession to a extra biblical ideology, right, through like feminism. And I don't think that feminism is really like extra biblical. I think some types of it are, like, you know, I'm probably like more so than my peers. I'm probably a little more pro-life than a lot of them. I think that's like kind of it's more of a civil issue, but I, like personally, I'm like anti-abortion. I don't think it's right, you know, and the whole like feminism thing, I think, is we see in the epistles and also in the gospel to some extent, like more like of a raising up of women than, you know, you do in Roman and Judean society at the time. So I don't think that feminism is like foreign to the gospel or foreign to the Bible, you know?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And, you know, you can even look at papal statements historically in the past. Mary Magdalene as the apostle to the apostles, and the countless women in all the Gospels called by name. Yeah. And unfortunately, a lot of times we don't focus on their stories.
Yeah, yeah. And my girlfriend, her name is Madeline, and so she's a big fan of Mary Magdalene, and so we always talk about her, and it's very sad. Like, I think the Gospels, from the perspective, and that ties back into what I was saying about if you have only men at a table, then, you know, only certain ideas are going to come about. Same thing with the writers of the Gospels. They were the literate members of Jesus's entourage, basically, right? And so they were the ones that were writing and journaling and talking about it and compiling these stories. And the women tended to be less literate. And, you know, you go into like, oh, well, I do not permit a woman to teach in 1 Timothy. That was. I'm very much of the opinion that was because you had illiterate women who might not have been able to study everything, you know, and that was causing like division and controversy, and they were trying to manage that sort of thing, you know. And so I think, just in general, I think that it's much easier to have a plain like first wave feminist reading of the epistles than it is to have like a anti-feminist, like even complementarian reading of it. Yeah.
I'm trying to think of what you were just saying, that I was just, yes, I want to pick out that point even more. The disciples of, I'm sorry, I'm losing it.
Yeah.
Well, the whole idea, for instance, of that Pauline injunction in one sense.
Yeah.
So even, for instance, canonical orthodoxy speaks about the distinction between the faith of the councils, where, for instance, the Nicene Constantinople Creed are articulated, and then the disciplinary canons of the ecumenical councils. Now, the Orthodox, for instance, will try to interpret the canonical reading of what the councils are saying as insofar as discipline as normative, but recognizing historical circumstances have changed. In one sense, I'm kind of hearing that kind of reading of scripture as well,
Right.
that there are certain immutable truths of the gospel themselves, but then there are certain injunctions that seem to apply at historical times for a particular congregation or congregations.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's something that, like, you know, my dad, you know, like I keep going back to him, but it's like that was so foundational for, like, you know, my idea of faith and how that changed later on as I developed my sense of self and everything. But he's like a biblical inerrant, and he believes in biblical inerrance. That's what I was trying to say, and like that gets to the point sometimes where it's like, oh yeah, you know, even the historical accidents of the text is inspired and you know, inerrant, and that's just I don't think that's a very reasonable way to look at it, to say the least. But yeah, I think it really just ties back to the whole concept of, okay, if women make up half of society, then how can you have a microcosm of society in like a parish or a diocese, and try to run that with only half of that, like someone representing half of that society, you know, in charge.
Although, you know, and unfortunately, this isn't going to come off across as well as I would like. But I would show, being a Roman Catholic priest for more than a decade, I was in charge, I was pastor. The women really ran the parish, though. I mean, and I knew that. And I was very, very clear about that, too, that for me, unfortunately, sometimes my own impression of the Independent Sacramental Movement can be even more clerical than Roman Catholic priests could ever hope. You know, because in one sense, Roman Catholic priests are told, you're going to this parish, you're doing this, versus in one sense, unfortunately, in the Independent Sacramental Movement, we kind of get to develop our own parishes and ministries and kind of form our own communities rather than going into a pre-existing community. How, as a deacon and transitional deacon going to the priesthood, how in one sense is that going to be a challenge for you then?
I think, you know, for me, I kind of look to my bishop for advice a lot more than I think some people would. Like I was, I talked to him about this interview and everything. He was like, "Oh yeah, I know Father Ben. He's great." And but I think some people are like play it a little more fast and loose. I only do that with my own missions, and I'm always keeping Bishop Anthony in communication about everything. I think that's something that we might be kind of lacking on, is like this discipline, and obviously we're never like, well, I won't say never, but we're not at the point where we can be like, oh yeah, we're going to assign this priest or this deacon to this parish, because a lot of jurisdictions have very few parishes in the first place, and many of our parishes have like way too many clergy.
Absolutely,
and,
yes.
Like St. Stanislaus, where I attend on a weekly basis, they're in the Ecumenical Catholic Communion, and they have, not including myself and some of the other like non-staff clergy, they have five clergy, 3 priests, 2 deacons, and then including the non-staff people, they have myself and another priest there. So it's like, it's for a parish that has like a weekly attendance of, or like a Sunday Mass attendance of like 100 people. So it's like that's a lot of clergy.
Absolutely, yeah. And unfortunately, I think we can kind of become far too clerical within our own jurisdictions
Yeah.
and communities and whatnot.